Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. There's a group of Star Wars fans out there who absolutely love the Imperial Class Star Destroyer, and I don't blame them. Who doesn't love a giant city-sized, wedge-shaped vessel that's bristling with turbo lasers? It's big, bold, over the top, and at least visually, to the untrained eye, very much fits into the Galactic Empire's promise of creating peace and stability through overpowering military force. But of course, that was a lie. I mean, in our last video, we talked about this extensively. No galactic government really had the capabilities of pacifying their entire territory through military means alone. You needed to try other approaches. And so the Imperial Class Star Destroyer was built, and looks can be very deceiving sometimes. Showmanship in a spectacular form might work in the marketing world for consumer products, but on the actual battlefield, how something looks doesn't really matter that much, and usually weak designs are outed very quickly. And judging by the performance of the Imperial Class Star Destroyer during the Galactic Civil War, I'm sorry to say it, but the designer of this vessel completely missed the mark. I'm actually not sure what they were aiming at in the first place. In place of creating an efficient and modern capital ship, with a primary focus of controlling large sectors of space around them with advanced communications and sensors along with a healthy amount of patrol fighters, what we have here is a vessel that is designed to instill fear into the hearts of its enemies, and in case that fails, it only has turbo lasers as a backup plan. There's a reason one of the vessels used during the Clone Wars by both the Republic and the Confederacy of Invented Systems look and function completely different from an IST. Now that's because those platforms were tested and modified for real combat. Whereas the Imperial Class Star Destroyer for more than a decade was completely untested and basically just paraded around to inspire fear and loyalty from the civilian populace. And guess what happens when you have an untested platform flying around in space pretending to be a war machine? Well, the Imperial Class Star Destroyer's Sovereign gets destroyed over Mustafar by a small ground team that infiltrates it. The Intimidator and Persecutor collide into each other over Scarif after one of the ships is disabled by ion torpedoes from a lowly Y-wing. Then you have those two Interdictor Class Star Destroyers that were lost at the Battle of Atollon. The Alliance to Restore the Republic was able to destroy several Imperial Class Star Destroyers without even fielding their own decent capital ship that could match that ship's firepower and armor. We oftentimes frame Rebel Alliance Navy victories over the Empire as great acts of courage, heroics that are, helped along by a good amount of luck. But is it possible that the Imperial Class Star Destroyer is not actually designed for a real war? Is it possible that instead of using industry experts, engineers, and designers, that Palpatine, in an ego-fueled craze, ordered the ISD simply because it reminds him of a few old Sith-era battleships he found out after digging up some old Republic-era manuscripts? Yeah, you bet he did.
It needs to be pointy. Round is not scary. Pointy is scary. This will put a smile on the faces of the enemy. They will think that it is a huge robot's dildo flying towards them.
Rommel always loved the quote, "No plan survives contact with the enemy." And the same sentiment rings true for weapons platforms. Ideally, a military is supposed to shift what kind of weapons and vehicles they produce depending on what kind of threats they're going to encounter in the near future. For decades, the United States has positioned its military force to excel in counterinsurgency operations against lightly armed combatants, usually hidden amongst the civilian populace, using asymmetrical warfare. This is why the US military placed a heavy emphasis on surgical strike munitions and also mobile and quick vehicles that were IED-proof. But with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, increased activity by China in the Southeast Sea, with increased activity of the various Iranian proxies functioning in the Middle East, the United States has now started to shift its armed forces back to fighting a conventional war, which is absolutely terrifying if you really think about what those words mean. And one of the latest vehicles the US has rolled out is this, the M10 Booker, which is essentially a cheap and fast self-propelled gun. This thing is not designed to engage tanks necessarily, and mainly built to give infantry supporting fire when they encounter an enemy position. In this way, the MT Booker is not that different from the other tank the United States used the last time the European continent was under the assault of one madman. We of course are talking about the M3 Sherman tank. This is a complete 180 pivot for the US military compared to where it was a few years ago. As recent as 2021, the US Marine Corps ditched the M1 Abrams main battle tank because it didn't fit the needs of a light expeditionary infantry fighting force. But also because the Marines and most American forces rarely needed fire support from a tank in Afghanistan or Iraq. You could get much more precise and longer range munitions delivered by fast movers or from fire bases nearby. The Empire goes from a conventional war with the remaining separatist holdouts at the end of the Clone Wars to a monumental peacekeeping mission that is designed to bring peace and stability to the entire galaxy. The enemies they would face were mainly pirates, bandits, rebels, aka lightly armed mobile fighters who enjoyed using asymmetrical warfare along with hit-and-run tactics. They were smart enough to never be in the same place long enough for the Empire to, move all of its firepower into place. Now, technically speaking, having a massive fleet of 25,000 Imperial Class Star Destroyers would be a good solution to that problem. Emphasize the class of Star Destroyer. That word invokes the image of mobility and increased firepower, smart firepower generally. But you see, the Imperial class is a lie. It's actually interesting that the Galactic Empire would even designate it a Star Destroyer when it's actually a battleship. The term Star Destroyer invokes a much more modern feel to it. I mean, in our own world, the Destroyer class only came around in the last 100 years or so, when the fruits of the Industrial Revolution had finally begun to spoil and led to the creation of some truly terrifying weapons platforms which have since shaped the battlefield. Weapons which, of course, dictated new doctrine, training, and tactics. The concept of the destroyer was created, like most weapons, that counter another ingenious weapon, known as the torpedo boat. You see, during the age of sail, naval engagements were generally fought at close ranges. You had a line of battle in which you would place your ships of the line, that's where that term comes from, and then you would basically get close to the enemy and exchange broadsides with them until one side gives up. Now, generally the largest fleet with the most firepower with the most ships would win the battle. Now, the ship of the line term would eventually evolve into the word battleship. The strategy with building modern battleships would evolve to its final form in the late 19th century, and these gigantic ships generally had three main qualities about them. One, they were amongst the largest and heaviest vessels in the ocean. The Iowa-class battleship was around 860 feet long, the same length as an Essex-class aircraft carrier, but 20,000 tons heavier. That's almost double the weight of an aircraft carrier, and this is because these battleships had so much armor placed on board. 30% of Japan's Yamato-class battleship's weight was armor, and in places that armor could be up to 26 inches thick. In comparison, a standard Sherman tank from that era had around 2.3 inches of sloped frontal armor. Even the King Tiger's thickest frontal hull armor was only 5.9 inches. In an extremely unlikely hypothetical situation, let's say during the invasion of Normandy, let's say one of the battleships get too close, one of the Allied battleships get too close to the shoreline, and you have a King Tiger firing upon it with its main gun. Well, those rounds would most likely just bounce off of the ship and do very little damage. But the thing is, offensive technology generally outpaces defensive technology, and the creation of the battleship and dreadnought class of ships would also increase the caliber of naval guns to just ridiculous sizes. There's basically no amount of armor that could stop a 16-inch gun, which shoots out projectiles that are close to the weight of a small car. As battleships became larger and more expensive to make, they became strategic assets. They're no longer ships of the line. They're at the core of a fleet, and they needed to be protected now. At the beginning of World War II, our friends over the Atlantic in the United Kingdom had the strongest fleet in the world, and that was built around roughly 15 battleships and battle cruisers, along with 7 aircraft carriers. And since strategic assets are something you rarely risk to enemy fire, battleships rarely ever dueled one another. And when they did, it was clear why. Very few people have the stomach for the kind of destruction such battles create. Take a look at what a shell from a 16-inch naval gun can do to the Yamato's 26-inch thick armor. And just decades after the first battleships were built, you started seeing alternative weapons that could really do a lot of damage but keep the operator safe and secure. Suddenly, a battleship's 16-inch naval gun with a 26.9-mile reach wasn't the furthest punching ship, and that changed everything drastically. First, you have the invention of the aircraft, which could be used as a spotter, and it could even drop munitions from up above and do damage to the top of the ship. But then you also have the invention of the torpedo, which was a complete game changer. Bombs and shells could target the superstructure of a craft, which caused damage and casualties, but a torpedo generally targets the hull of ship below the waterline. Now, there are cases in which bombs penetrate the deck and set off a ship's magazine. That usually is a kill shot, but torpedo breaches usually create holes so large that even the mighty battleship can be sunk by one well-placed shot below the waterline. When you combine a torpedo with a plane, it becomes an extremely deadly platform, and when you combine a torpedo with a boat, it becomes a very cheap, efficient, and deadly platform. Torpedoes became an equalizer for nations that could not afford to build an actual battleship. If you take a look at countries like Iran and North Korea, who lack true blue water navy capabilities, you'll notice that they, to this day, still rely on fast torpedo boats as an equalizer against their much more technologically advanced enemies. But here's the thing, they'll probably never get close to their target because most modern navies now have escort fleets wrapped around their most prized ships. That's where the destroyer came into play. It was first invented to take out small and swift enemy ships, usually torpedo boats. Destroyers quickly became the mainstay of most modern navies and would soon replace the battleship as the most powerful surface vessel when it comes to direct firepower. What makes a destroyer different from a battleship? They both have a lot of firepower. Well, it's mobility and purpose. A battleship is designed for fire support missions and not much else. An escort destroyer is designed to patrol and screen the area for a variety of different threats in the air, on the sea, and even below the waves. Destroyers are just bristling with different violent solutions, from deck guns to anti-aircraft guns to even torpedoes and depth charges. Modern-day destroyers usually carry several missile launchers on board and have far more firepower than the battleships of yesterday. And one quick look at the Imperial Class Star Destroyer, and it's very obvious that this is a heavily armored battleship, not a destroyer. The ISD has a ridiculous amount of durasteel plating on it. It has massive turbo lasers suitable for orbital bombardment, aka fire support from the heavens. It can even slug it out with other large capital ships, something it rarely got to do during the Galactic Civil War until really the last year. And of course, the Star Destroyer is woefully under-equipped to fight smaller starfighters and gunships, or the rebel equivalent of a torpedo boat, a Corellian freighter with some proton munitions attached to it. The Imperial Class Star Destroyer needs an escort fleet in order to survive, which, goes against the very nature of what a Star Destroyer should be. Now look, there are cases when you still need battleships. The USS Wisconsin, widely known as the last American battleship to see combat, was used during the First Persian Gulf as a cheap alternative to using cruise missiles and other expensive platforms for destroying targets. And in 2199, facing extinction from an alien race known as the Gamulas, Earth scientists secretly would build the space battleship Yamato in the ruins of the World War II vessel with the same name. Now there are cases where the Imperial Class Star Destroyer's many turbo lasers are very useful, like when the Empire besieges entire planets and takes out enemy fortifications or planetary shields. I mean, it's okay for every sector fleet to have a few of these ISDs, but the Imperial Navy made the Imperial class the backbone of their entire fleet, and they based all of their naval doctrine around this antiquated platform. It's really frustrating how poorly designed the Imperial Class Star Destroyer is, and if you just take a look at the Clone Wars, you had one side, the Republic, utilizing assault carriers. The Imperial Class Star Destroyer could never duke it out at close ranges with the ISD, but the idea would be to never even stay in the same system as the Imperial ship. I mean, the carrier battles of the Pacific were really just a game of cat and mouse, with both sides trying to find the other fleet first so that they could send their bombers and hopefully wipe them out before they could wipe out your unfloating landing strip. The stakes were incredibly high. Usually the first person to see the other fleet won. But if a carrier stumbled upon just a normal fleet without a carrier, they could easily just bomb and torpedo from afar until they run out of aircraft or destroy all of the enemy ships. This is the ideal outcome that every commander wants: hit your enemy without exposing your important ships to any danger. And as we see in the Galactic Civil War, that's exactly how the rebellion survived. They managed to run circles around the much larger and better equipped Imperial Navy. Until the Rebel Alliance created that base on Yavin 4, they were just one large mobile carrier fleet that occasionally sent out sorties to harass the enemy. Even the Confederacy of Independent Systems relied on a carrier model, although their droids were much shorter range and usually not hyperdrive equipped. Also, Confederacy had really advanced missile technology that again allows you to fire at the enemy outside of line of sight, which is important when you're trying to deal with turbo lasers. And to make the ISD platform's design even more shockingly dumb is the fact that this ship has very few point defense weapons on board. The majority of the emplacements on this ship are turbo lasers or iron turrets, and so it's quite easy for enemy fighters to strafe the crap out of this thing and get real close. Also, for a ship that is designed to function in a 360-degree threat environment, the ISD had two massive blind spots at the rear and also at the bottom of the ship. And the bridge of the ship is placed up high in an exposed area, copying the Venator class Star Destroyer's design. But the Venator actually had a reason for having a very high tower. You see, it had two bridges. One commanded the actual ship, and the other one was for air traffic control because of the sheer amount of starfighters it had on board. The Imperial Class Star Destroyer did not need a giant tower for aircraft control capabilities. What it did need was a hardened bridge, preferably in the center of the ship, that would allow it to survive more broadside exchanges. And so yeah, the Galactic Empire's strategy of dismantling the Republic Navy and then building their own fleet of Star Destroyers is the equivalent of the United States getting rid of all of their carriers, including the super carriers, and then just replacing them with modernized versions of the Iowa-class battleship. It'd be really dumb if we did that.